The telegraph boy saw her first. He was 14, hauling a mail sack across the depot platform, and he stopped because something was wrong with the picture below the viaduct. A girl, older than him maybe, hard to tell under the patched coat, was lying flat on the frozen ground at the base of the central pier, working a piece of metal into the stone with both hands. One hand was bare. The other wore a single mitten, the left one. Blood had smeared across the iron plate she was prying at, and the blood was already freezing dark against the metal. The wind was tearing through the gorge arches hard enough to make the mail sack swing, but the girl did not look up. Behind her, the sky to the northwest had gone the color of something poured, flat and heavy and closing. The boy set the sack down. He could not have said why he kept watching, only that the girl's hands moved with a patience that did not match what the sky was about to do. The placement agent's ledger listed her as Keen, M., age 17, country of origin Ireland, disposition stubborn, unsuitable for household discipline. 2 placements, 1 return, 1 escape, 4 cents in her coat pocket, and a bread heel wrapped in brown paper. That was the full accounting of Mara Keen's worth in Dakota Territory on the 11th of January, 1888, and the ledger did not lie about much except the things that mattered. She had come west on a placement train out of Boston, 43 children in a converted passenger car, each one tagged with a number and a destination like freight. Her mother had died 7 months earlier in a laundry fire on Stillman Street, and the Sisters of Charitable Service had processed Mara through their system with the efficiency of women who had seen 1,000 orphans and could not afford to remember any of them. The first placement sent her to a wheat farm near Fargo, where the husband worked her 16 hours and the wife locked the root cellar at night. She lasted 4 months. The second placement fell apart in 11 days when Mara refused to let a minister's wife cut her hair. The agent's note read, "Girl is not manageable. Recommend institutional return." But the institution was 1,200 miles east, and Rufus Dane, the man who managed the Western Circuit of Placements, did not want to pay for the ticket. So Mara had become a problem that moved sideways instead of forward. She had spent 3 weeks attached to a rail construction camp as a cook's helper, unofficial, unpaid, invisible in the way that girls without papers became invisible near railroad work. She had slept on flour sacks. She had eaten what the cook scraped from the serving pot. She had listened. And then the camp broke for winter, and the cook told her she could not follow. She arrived at Split Pine Gorge on foot, following the rail spur through 2 miles of frozen scrub because the road was drifted shut. The gorge was a knife cut in the prairie, where the new branch line crossed a narrow granite gap, and the railroad had built a 6-arch stone viaduct across it, not because stone was practical in Dakota, but because the company owned a quarry 11 miles south and wanted a showpiece that Eastern investors could photograph. The viaduct stood 80 feet above the gorge floor at its highest point, pale stone against gray sky, and it was the only structure for 7 miles in any direction that was not made of wood. The town, if it could be called a town, was a depot, a telegraph shack, a boarding house, and a section foreman's cabin clustered at the east end of the bridge approach. 9 permanent residents in winter, fewer when the storms hit. Mara had no axe, no stove, no timber claim, no letter of introduction. No adult anywhere on the continent who was legally obligated to keep her alive. She had 1 wool skirt, a patched coat missing its second button, 1 mitten, the left. The right had been confiscated as punishment at the minister's house, a broken awl she had stolen from the cook's kit in the 4 cents. The bread heel was already stale enough to crack a tooth. The nearest settlement with the general store was 7 miles east along the track, and she could not go there because Dane had posted a $5 recovery notice at every depot and boarding house between Fargo and the Montana line. Any adult who recognized her name would collect the money and hand her back. She could not go east. She could not go west. She could not stay on the platform because the station master would see her before dark, and the sky to the northwest had turned the color of lead poured into a mold, flat, heavy, and descending. Abner Clegg found her at 3:30 in the afternoon. He was 58 years old, the station master at Split Pine, a former Army teamster who had hauled powder wagons across the Bozeman Trail and still walked with the careful, weight-balanced step of a man who had spent years expecting the ground to explode. He had a white beard trimmed close to the jaw, hands like saddle leather, and a policy about strangers: feed them once, ask their business, and send them on. He found Mara crouched behind 3 empty freight barrels on the leeward side of the depot, her one mitten pressed against her mouth to keep her breathing quiet. Clegg studied her for a long moment. He looked at the coat, the single mitten, the way she had positioned herself so the wind could not reach her from 2 directions at once. That last detail told him something. A person who understood wind angles was not entirely helpless, but understanding wind and surviving it were different things. "Name," he said. She told him. "Placed out?" She did not answer, which was answer enough. Clegg set a tin cup of coffee on the barrel nearest her and waited while she drank it. Then he gave the verdict that she already knew was coming, but needed to hear spoken aloud so that the full weight of it could settle into her chest. "No axe, no stove, no timber. You do not have a winter problem, girl. You have a burial problem." Mara set the cup down. Her hand did not shake. She had been told she was going to die before Issa, not in those words exactly, but in all the small administrative ways that institutions tell children they are disposable: the note in the ledger, the locked root cellar, the confiscated mitten, each one a small sentence. And this was just a larger version of the same grammar. "I did not ask to be buried," she said. "Nobody does," Clegg said. "But you will notice the ground does not consult us." He pointed northwest, where the sky had dropped another shade darker. The storm line was visible now, not as cloud exactly, but as an absence of horizon. The place where sky and prairie had been 2 separate things was now one thing, and it was moving. "That will be here by full dark," Clegg said. "If you're still in the gorge when it arrives, I will not be able to reach you. Nobody will." He said it without cruelty. He said it as a man who had counted bodies after blizzards and understood the arithmetic. The gorge bottom had almost no usable timber. The railroad had cleared everything within 200 yards of the bridge for fire prevention. The viaduct itself cast a wind tunnel through the gap, accelerating the gusts until they could knock a grown man sideways. There was no cave, no overhang deep enough to block wind, no abandoned shack. The section foreman's cabin was locked. The boarding house would report her to Dane within the hour. Mara looked at the gorge. She looked at the viaduct. She looked at the sky. "How far down does the stone go?" she asked. Clegg frowned. "What?" "The bridge piers, the stone footings. How far into the ground?" 30 feet, maybe more. They sank them to bedrock. Why?" Mara did not answer. She was calculating something Clegg could not see, a memory surfacing through the cold, carrying with it the smell of lime dust and wet wool and lantern smoke. 3 months earlier, in the last week of the rail camp's operation, she had met a man named Tobin Vale. He was 63, Welsh-born, a stonemason hired to inspect frost damage along culverts and bridge footings before winter sealed them shut. He walked with a permanent limp from a quarry accident that had crushed his left ankle 20 years before, and he had the hands of a man who had spent his life reading rock the way other men read newspapers, running his fingers along grain and fracture lines, pressing his palm flat against surfaces, waiting for the stone to tell him something. The younger engineers on the rail crew disliked Tobin because he worked slowly and trusted his hands before their instruments. They called him the Mole because he spent his days below grade, inside culverts and inspection chambers, while they stood above in clean coats and read transit levels. But Tobin had never lost a footing to frost heave, and the engineers had lost two that season. One afternoon, Tobin had caught Mara watching him work inside a railway culvert. Instead of chasing her off, he had pressed her palm against the lower wall of the stonework, below the frost line, where the ground held steady. "Feel that," he said. The stone was warm, not hot, not even comfortable, but warm in a way that the air above was not, and warm in a way that the upper stones were not. "Stone below frost keeps yesterday's heat longer than a person keeps anger," Tobin said. He smiled at his own words, the way old men sometimes smiled when they said something they had been thinking for years. "The earth is slow. It remembers summer down here long after the air has forgotten." Mara had not understood why that mattered. She filed it the way she filed everything, silently, without comment, in the part of her mind where useful things collected like tools in a borrowed kit. Now, standing in a gorge with no shelter, and no fire, and no time, she understood. The viaduct piers went 30 feet into the ground. At that depth, the earth held a temperature that had nothing to do with the air above. The Department of Energy would one day document what Tobin already knew by touch. Ground temperatures 30 feet below the surface hold relatively steady year-round, usually somewhere between 50 and 59 degrees in most of the northern states. But Mara did not need a government report. She needed a door. She left Clegg standing at the depot and walked down the embankment into the gorge. The wind hit her immediately. It came through the arches like a living thing, not gusting but pressing, a constant sideways force that pushed her coat against her ribs and made her eyes stream. The gorge floor was bare rock and crusted snow, scraped clean by the tunnel effect. There was no wood. There was no shelter. There was nothing except stone and wind and the growing dark. She reached the central pier, the largest of the 6 supports, built wider than the others because it carried the highest point of the span. The stone was gray granite, dressed smooth by masons who had come and gone years before she arrived. At the base of the pier, where the stone met the ground, she found what she was looking for, a narrow iron rectangle, maybe 2 feet by 3, set into the stone at ground level. Around its edges, the snow had softened, not melted, just loosened. The crusted surface that everywhere else could bear her weight was here compressed and grainy, as if something beneath the plate was breathing, slow and warm and patient. Mara dropped to her knees. She pressed her bare hand, the one without a mitten, against the iron. It was cold, but not the killing cold of the surface stone. There was a difference, small but real. She pulled the broken awl from her coat. Nell Birtle found her there 20 minutes later. Nell was 32, widowed, and worked as the cook at the boarding house. She was not a cruel woman, but she had spent enough winters in Dakota to know what kindness cost and what it bought, and the exchange rate was not favorable. She had seen girls disappear before, not in the dramatic way of newspaper stories, but in the quiet way of ledger entries that stopped updating. Nell watched Mara jamming the awl under the edge of the iron plate, chipping at frozen grit with raw fingers. "Stone is what graves are made of, not beds," Nell said. Mara did not look up. "I have slept in worse than a grave." "Have you died in one?" "Not yet." Nell stood in the wind and watched. There was something in the way the girl worked, not frantic, not desperate, but systematic, moving the awl from corner to corner, testing each edge for the loosest seam that kept Nell from walking away. It was the same quality that had once made Nell herself interesting to a man who was now buried outside Bismarck. Competence worn so quietly it looked like stubbornness. If you open that and there is nothing inside but a drainage pit, Nell said, you will fall and break your legs and freeze in the dark. You understand that? If I stay up here, Mara said, I will freeze in the light. I prefer the dark. It is more private. Nell almost laughed. She bit it back because laughter in a gorge at sundown in January felt like tempting something. You are a strange girl, Nell said. I have been told. Nell left, but she did not go far, and she did not stop watching. The awl was not enough. The iron plate was set into a stone channel and sealed with frozen gravel and rust. Mara found a stone chip with a flat edge and used it as a wedge, hammering with a second rock until the rim began to loosen. The work cost her knuckles. Blood appeared on her right hand, a cut across the palm where the iron edge caught skin. She wrapped it with the paper from the bread heel and kept working. The sky was darker now. The storm line had erased the northwestern horizon completely, and the wind had shifted from steady to gusty, which meant the front was close. Mara had perhaps 90 minutes before full dark and perhaps 2 hours before the blizzard. The plate moved, not much, a finger width, but enough for the dark to breathe at her. The air that came through the gap was warm, not warm like a room, warm like a promise, like the difference between dying and merely suffering. She could smell damp stone and still air and something mineral and deep, the smell of earth that had not seen sunlight in years. Every reasonable part of her said to stop. A reasonable person would walk to the depot, accept Clegg's coffee, wait for Dane, and go back east to whatever institution would take her. A reasonable person understood that a 17-year-old girl with one mitten and a broken awl did not climb into dark holes beneath railroad bridges during blizzards. But reasonable people had built the system that tagged children like freight. Reasonable people had locked root cellars and confiscated mittens and written unsuitable next to her name. Reason had not been her ally. She had no cause to start trusting it now. She worked the plate wider. The news reached the depot before Mara reached the bottom of whatever lay beneath the iron plate. Gossip in a 9-person settlement moved faster than weather. That girl from the placement train is under the bridge. Under it how? Trying to pry open a hatch in the central pier. A hatch? For what? She thinks there is a room in there, a room inside the stone. Rufus Dane heard it from the telegraph operator, who had heard it from Nell, who had not meant to tell anyone but could not help herself. Dane was 46 years old, smooth-faced, and wore a black overcoat that he kept brushed because appearances were the only currency he truly understood. He carried a leather ledger with children's names written in columns, received, placed, returned, pending, and the handwriting was neat in the way that indifference is neat, each entry given exactly the same space regardless of what had happened to the child it named. Dane had arrived at Split Pine by sleigh that morning, following Mara's trail with the unhurried patience of a man who knew the system was on his side. He had paperwork. He had authority. He had the $5 recovery notice posted at every depot within 100 miles. What he did not have, and what kept him moving through the cold instead of waiting for her to surface, was certainty that Mara Keene would stay quiet about what she had seen at his placement house in Fargo. There were bruises on children sent west under his supervision. There were entries in his ledger that did not match the entries in the official record. There were questions that Mara could answer if anyone thought to ask, and Dane needed her back inside the system before anyone did. He found Clegg at the depot stove and produced the paperwork. "The girl is a runaway," Dane said. "She's under my authority until reassigned. I need her returned tonight." Clegg looked at the papers. They were real enough, stamped, signed, carrying the weight of an institution that processed children by the trainload. He looked at Dane's brushed coat and neat ledger and thought of Mara's one mitten and cut hand. "She is in the gorge," Clegg said, "under the central pier." "Doing what?" "Opening a hatch." Dane's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes recalculated. A girl hiding under a freight awning was a recovery. A girl inside railroad property was a complication. "That is company property," Diane said. "She is trespassing." "She is freezing," Clegg said. "A runaway learns shelter by being denied it," Diane said. "That is the policy. You bring them back, you feed them, you house them inside the system, you do not let them nest under bridges like animals." Clegg said nothing. He was not yet prepared to defend Mara. He barely knew the girl, and the paperwork was real. But Dane's sentence sat wrong in his chest. The word nest in particular. You use that word for vermin, not children. The gossip sharpened into something harder as the afternoon darkened. In the boarding house, the telegraph operator told the section foreman's wife. The section foreman's wife told the depot hand. Each retelling added a detail. She bit a matron in Boston. She stole silver from a placement home. She sleeps under bridges. She thinks a stone pier has a stove in it. None of these were precisely true. Mara had never bitten anyone. She had taken the awl from the cook's kit, not silver from a home. She did not think the pier contained a stove. But truth in a frontier settlement was whatever version arrived first, and Diane's version, dangerous, ungrateful, disturbed, arrived before Mara could tell her own. Mara heard the gossip the way sound travels in a gorge, broken by wind into fragments, sharp enough to cut, but not enough to see clearly. She caught ungrateful drifting down from the embankment. She caught dangerous from somewhere near the depot platform. She stopped listening and started working faster. The social mathematics were now as clear as the survival mathematics. If she stepped into town, she would be handed to Dane before morning. If she stayed in the gorge, she had the stone and the cold and whatever lay beneath the iron plate. One option ended her freedom. The other might end her life. She had made this kind of calculation before. The answer was always the same. If you have ever been told your only choices were surrender or ruin, and you refuse to believe it, tell us about it in the comments. This story is just getting started. The plate moved another inch, then another. They all snapped at the handle. The wood was old, and the cold had made it brittle, and Mara was left with a 3-inch blade and no grip. She wrapped the stump in the strip of paper and used it as a punch, tapping with the wedge stone, working the frozen gravel out of the channel grain by grain. The blood from her palm had frozen onto the iron rim. She would leave that mark there, a dark smear on cold metal, and hours later, at dusk, Rufus Dane would find it and know exactly where she had gone. But that was hours away. Right now the plate was moving. The dark air rising from below was steady and warm against her face, and it carried the smell of deep stone and still water and the faintest trace of lime, the same smell she remembered from Tobin's culvert, the same smell that meant the earth remembered warmth even when everything above it had forgotten. Mara braced her shoulder against the plate and pushed. The hatch swung open with a sound like a coffin lid dragging across stone, a low, grinding protest that echoed down into the dark below. For a moment she could see nothing, then her eyes adjusted, and she saw the rungs, iron rungs set into the stone wall of a vertical shaft, descending into a darkness so complete it looked solid. She had no lantern. She had no rope. She had 4 cents and half in all, and 1 mitten and a cut hand, and a blizzard bearing down on the only place she had ever stood that was not owned by someone who wanted her gone. Mara put her foot on the first rung. The iron was cold but stable. The second rung held. The third. She descended into the dark with her hand pressed against the stone wall, and with every foot she dropped, The wind sound dulled and the air changed. At 10 feet, the gusts became a distant moan. At 20, her breath stopped smoking. At 30, the shaft widened and her foot touched flat stone instead of another rung. She was standing in a chamber. She could not see its edges. She could feel the stillness, not empty stillness, but held stillness, the kind that comes from mass and depth and stone that has been absorbing the earth's slow heat for years. The air was cool but not cold. Her fingers, which had been numb for an hour, began to ache as feeling returned. Somewhere above her, the wind screamed through the arches of the split pine viaduct. Down here, 30 feet below the gorge floor, inside a foundation inspection chamber that the railroad had built for engineers and forgotten about, the air was still. The stone was almost warm. The earth remembered summer. Mara Keene sat down on the stone floor, pressed her back against the wall, and let herself breathe. But she could not breathe long. The hatch was open above her, and the wind was finding the shaft. She could feel the draft beginning, cold air pushing down, warm air rising, the beginning of a convection current that would strip the chamber's warmth in hours if she let it run. Tobin had taught her this without knowing he was teaching survival. Air movement kills warmth. Still air holds it. A sealed space with mass around it changes slowly. An open space changes fast. She climbed back up. Every rung cost her more than the descent, because now her hands were warming, and the cold iron burned instead of numbed. At the top, the wind hit her like a wall. She grabbed the nearest loose thing, a piece of burlap sacking that had blown against the pier base, and stuffed it into the gap between the hatch rim and the shaft opening. It was not a seal. It was a suggestion, but it slowed the draft. Then she climbed back down, and this time she began to work. She could not see the chamber, but she could feel it. Her hands told her the dimensions, roughly 8 feet across, with a stone footing in the center and a drainage sump on the far side where water seeped and collected. The sump was the danger. If she stepped into it in the dark, she would be standing in ankle-deep water that would soak through her boots and end her faster than the wind above. She found loose stones near the base of the footing and placed them in a line along the sump's edge, a wall she could feel with her feet, a boundary between the dry floor and the wet. She pulled down the scrap plank that she had seen wedged against the shaft wall, a piece of staging left by the original builders, and laid it across the driest section of floor. A platform, not a bed, but a surface between her body and the stone, which would wick heat from her through contact if she lay directly on it. She hung her coat on a rung to dry. The still air would not dry it fast, but it would not freeze it either. In the open air above, a wet coat became an ice sheath in minutes. Down here, it would merely be damp. She marked the latter side of the chamber with scratches from the broken awl, 3 parallel lines at shoulder height that she could find by touch if the darkness became disorienting. She had no lantern, no candle, nothing to burn, but she could navigate by touch if she kept the scratches on her right and the sump on her left. The work steadied her. Each task was small and specific, and each one moved the odds a fraction of a degree. Block the draft, mark the walls, avoid the water, keep cloth off the stone. These were not grand innovations. They were the accumulated logic of a girl who had spent her life sleeping in places that were not meant for sleeping, flour sacks, root cellars, freight platforms, and who had learned that survival was not a single large decision but an unending series of small ones, each one buying another hour. Above her, the blizzard was arriving. She could hear it now, not as wind but as sound itself, a roar that filled the gorge and pressed against the hatch like a living weight. Snow would be filling the shaft opening, packing against the burlap, sealing her in more effectively than she could seal herself. For the moment, that was good. Snow was insulation. Snow was silence. Snow was a door that locked from the outside and kept the warm air in, but snow was also a trap. If it packed hard enough over the hatch, she would not be able to push it open from below. And if she could not get out, the chamber that was saving her life tonight would become the grave that Nell Birtle had warned her about. Mara pressed her back against the stone and listened to the storm build. The wall was cool and solid and faintly, impossibly warm 30 feet below a Dakota blizzard. Tobin Vale had been right. The earth remembered. The question was whether anyone above would remember her. At dusk, Rufus Dane reached the central pier. He saw the blood on the iron rim, a dark smear already freezing into the metal. He saw the burlap stuffed into the gap. He understood, in the administrative way he understood everything, that the girl had gone below. He did not go down after her. Instead, he found the outer hasp, a simple iron loop meant for a padlock, and began looking for something to pin it shut. The storm that night was not the killing storm. That distinction mattered, because the killing storm was still days away, and the difference between the two was the difference between a warning and a sentence. The first storm dropped 9 inches of dry snow into Split Pine Gorge, packed the hatch under a drift, and drove the temperature to 14 below with wind chill. Mara spent the night in the chamber with no light, no food. The bread heel was gone by midnight, and no certainty that morning would bring anything except a harder version of the same problem. She slept in fragments, waking each time the cold crept closer, pressing her body against the stone wall where the faint warmth held. The platform kept her off the wet floor. The burlap and snow above her slowed the draft. The air in the lower chamber stayed above freezing. She knew this not by instrument, but by the simple fact that the water seeping into the sump had not frozen. She was alive. That was not the same as being safe. At first light, she climbed the rungs and forced the hatch open against the snow. The sky was pale and hard. The gorge was white. The viaduct arches rose above her like the ribs of something enormous and dead, and the wind had scoured the snow into knife-edged drifts against every vertical surface. Her hands were raw. Her cut palm had crusted over but cracked open again when she gripped the iron. She could see the depot from the base of the pier, smoke from the stovepipe, a lantern in the window, and she understood that 700 feet of open ground was the distance between her and warmth, food, and capture. She did not cross it. Instead, she began the work that would determine whether the chamber could hold her for more than a single night. The first problem was draft. The hatch fit poorly. It had been designed for inspection access, not habitation, and the iron rim left a gap of nearly half an inch along the eastern edge. Mara could feel the cold air sliding through that gap like water through a crack in a dam, thin, constant, and erosive. She packed the gap with frozen mud and gravel, pressing it into the seam with her bare fingers until her nails tore. The mud would not hold permanently, but it slowed the airflow enough that she could feel the difference 10 feet down the shaft. The second problem was water. The drainage sump collected seep from the surrounding stone, and the water level rose and fell with ground conditions. If a thaw came, unlikely in January, but possible during a brief warm spell, the sump could overflow and flood the chamber floor. She needed to keep her platform above the waterline at all times. She found 2 flat stones near the pier base and carried them down, one at a time, wedging them under the plank to raise it 3 inches. A small change, but 3 inches of air between her body and standing water was the difference between damp and hypothermic. The third problem was darkness. She had no candle, no lantern, no matches. The chamber was absolute black once the hatch closed. She could navigate by touch, the scratches on the wall, the stone line along the sump, but she could not work, could not check for water, could not see her own hands. She needed fire, and fire needed fuel and air, and fuel and air were the two things the chamber could least afford to waste. She solved the fuel problem by scavenging. The gorge was stripped of timber, but it was not stripped of everything. Against the base of the second pier, she found scraps from the original construction, a broken barrel stave, a length of tarred rope, shims of dry pine that had been wedged between stones and forgotten. Near the embankment, half buried in snow, she found a crate that had fallen from a freight car, smashed, but with 3 usable slats. She gathered everything she could carry and stacked it near the hatch opening, then lowered each piece down the shaft by hand. She did not yet have matches. That problem would require another kind of solution. It was Nell Birtle who provided it, though Nell would not have described what she did as kindness. At mid-morning, Mara found a bundle tucked under the outer arch of the viaduct, pressed into a gap between stones where the wind could not reach it. 2 biscuits, a tin cup, a strip of flannel, and wrapped inside the flannel 6 sulfur matches and a stub of tallow candle no longer than her thumb. There was no note. There did not need to be. Mara recognized the biscuits. They were the same hard, flat rounds that the boarding house served to railroad men, and only Nell made them. She lit the candle in the chamber and saw the space for the first time. It was smaller than she had imagined. 8 feet across, roughly circular, with the stone footing of the pier rising through the center like a column. The walls were dressed granite, smooth, gray, sweating faintly with moisture. The ceiling was low enough that she could touch it without straightening her arm. The sump occupied the far quarter of the floor, a shallow basin of dark water that reflected the candlelight in a single unsteady eye. The air smelled of lime and wet stone and old iron. It was not a room, it was a void, a space that existed because the engineers needed access to the pier foundation, not because anyone had ever intended a human being to live in it. The walls bore chalk marks from the last inspection, numbers, dates, shorthand that meant nothing to her. A rusted iron bolt protruded from the wall near the ladder, and she hung the tin cup on it. The candle would last perhaps 3 hours. She could not afford to burn it all at once. She blew it out after 10 minutes and sat in the dark, eating half a biscuit, and planned. She needed more insulation for the hatch seal. She needed a way to keep the candle stubs dry. She needed food that would last more than a day. She needed to know whether the chamber's warmth would hold through a sustained storm, or whether it would bleed away once the ground surface froze hard enough to penetrate deeper. She needed, in other words, everything she did not have and could not buy with 4 cents. What she had was time, measured in hours before the next storm, and hands that still worked, and a mind that had been trained by deprivation to think in small, precise increments. One problem at a time. One solution at a time. 1 hour bought, then another, until the hours accumulated into something that resembled survival. She was on her hands and knees near the pier base, scraping frozen mud into the hatch seam for the second time, when a voice spoke from behind her. "You blocked the draft before you made a bed." Mara spun. A man stood at the edge of the gorge path, leaning on a walking stick, his left foot turned at an angle that said the ankle beneath it had been rebuilt by a surgeon who did not care about symmetry. He wore a canvas coat stiff with cold, a wool cap pulled low over ears that were red and peeling, and he carried a leather satchel that clinked faintly with the sound of metal tools. Tobin Vale looked older than she remembered. 3 months of winter had deepened the lines around his eyes and whitened the stubble on his jaw. His limp was worse. The cold did that to old injuries, and his breathing had a rasp in it that had not been there in October. But his hands were the same, large, scarred, patient. The hands of a man who listened to stone. "You are the cook's girl," he said, "from the rail camp." "I'm nobody's girl," Mara said. Tobin studied the hatch. He studied the mud seal. He studied the gap she had packed and the direction she had packed it, windward side first, which was correct because wind pressure would push the packing deeper instead of pulling it loose. "Who taught you to seal a draft like that?" he asked. "You did," Mara said. Tobin was quiet for a long moment. Then he set his satchel down and lowered himself carefully onto the stone, favoring his bad ankle, and looked at the hatch with the expression of a man who had just been shown something he had built without knowing it. "Show me what is down there," he said. He had been hired to inspect frost heave along the viaduct footings, the same work he had done in October, now repeated because the railroad wanted a winter assessment before the spring thaw cycle. He had arrived at Split Pine that morning on the work train, planning to spend 2 days checking mortar joints and drainage flow. He had not planned to find a 17-year-old girl living inside one of his inspection chambers. But Tobin Vale was not a man who confused the unexpected with the impossible. He had spent 40 years reading stone, and stone had taught him that the most important things were usually the ones hidden below the surface. He descended the ladder behind Mara, and she watched his face in the candlelight as he looked at what she had done. He saw the stone line along the sump. He saw the raised platform. He saw the coat hung on the rung. He saw the chalk marks she had added to his old ones, her scratch lines for navigation, spaced at intervals she could reach by touch. "You did this in the dark," he said. "I did not have a candle until this morning." Tobin pressed his palm against the lower wall. He held it there for a long time, feeling the temperature, the moisture, the grain of the stone. Then he pulled a cracked pocket thermometer from his satchel. The glass was chipped and the mercury column had a bubble in it, but it read, and held it at arm's length in the still air of the chamber. 51 degrees, he said, with the hatch open. What would it be with the hatch closed? Higher, 53, 54, maybe more if you seal the shaft properly. He looked at her. You understand what that means. It means I will not freeze. It means the difference between the air down here and the air up there is 70 degrees or more during a hard storm. That is not a shelter. That is a different climate. He paused. It is also a trap if you do not manage the air. You are burning a candle. A candle eats oxygen. This chamber is small. If you seal it completely and burn a flame, you will fall asleep and not wake up. Mara felt the warning settle into her chest. She had not thought about oxygen. She had been so focused on keeping the cold out that she had not considered what she was keeping in. How much air do I need? She asked. More than you think, less than you fear. Tobin pointed to the hatch seal. Leave a gap, a finger width, enough for air to breathe through, not enough for wind to push through. The draft you feel should be no stronger than a whisper. If the candle flame bends more than a thumb's width, the gap is too large. If the flame stands straight and tall and the air tastes thick, the gap is too small. He taught her through demonstration, not lecture. He held the candle near every seam in the chamber wall, watching the flame for movement. Where it flickered, air was entering, through mortar joints, through the drainage channel, through cracks in the stone that were invisible to the eye, but real to fire. He showed her which leaks to seal and which to leave. He showed her how to build a raised bed from planks, so that her body heat would not be conducted away by contact with cold stone. He showed her how to position herself in the chamber so that the natural convection, warm air rising, cool air settling, would keep the warmest layer at her sleeping level. Each lesson was a specific action. Hold the candle here. Feel the wall there. Count the seconds between flame movements. Read the stone the way he read it, with patience, with touch, with the understanding that stone does not hurry, and neither should the person asking it questions. You listen to the stone before you listen to the men, Tobin said, when they climbed back to the surface. The wind hit them both, and Tobin pulled his collar up with a wince that suggested his lungs did not enjoy the contrast. "That is why you are still alive. The men would have told you to walk to town and accept what was waiting for you there." "The men did tell me that," Mara said. "Well, and the stone told you something different." "The stone did not tell me anything. It was warm. I went where it was warm." Tobin almost smiled. "That is what listening to stone sounds like." Abner Clegg appeared at the gorge rim that afternoon. He had not come to help. He had come to check. The way a man checks on something he expects to find dead, hoping to be wrong, but planning for the alternative. He stood at the edge and looked down at Mara, who was hauling a second plank from the construction debris near the pier base. "You are still here," Clegg said. "You sound surprised." "I am. How cold did it get last night?" "I do not know the number. I know my water did not freeze." Clegg processed this. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, the same small recalculation that happens when a fact contradicts a verdict. "Dane is still at the depot," Clegg said. "He wants you on the eastbound tomorrow." "I will not be on the eastbound. He has papers." "I have a door that locks from underneath." Clegg looked at the hatch, at the mud seal, at the blood smear on the iron rim that the cold had preserved like a signature. He looked at Mara's hands, raw, cracked, one still wrapped in the bread heel paper. He looked at the plank she was dragging. "A bridge can carry a train," Clegg said. "It cannot carry a life." Mara did not argue. She had learned that arguing with authority figures spent energy that could be used for work, and work was the only argument that mattered. She dragged the plank to the hatch and lowered it into the shaft. The days between the first storm and the killing storm numbered 6. Mara used every hour. She improved the hatch seal with a mixture of mud, gravel, and shredded burlap, working it into the channel until the gap was reduced to the finger width Tobin had prescribed. She tested it with the candle stub. The flame bent slightly, a whisper of draft, not a shout. Enough air to breathe, not enough wind to steal heat. She built a crude shelf from a barrel stave wedged between 2 protruding stones, and on it she placed the matches, the candle stubs, and the tin cup, everything that could not be allowed to get wet. She lined the sleeping platform with the flannel strip and a piece of burlap, creating a layer between her body and the wood. She carried down a flat stone and placed it where she could sit upright, using the stone footing as a backrest. Tobin came each day. He was supposed to be inspecting the viaduct, and he did, working his way along the arches with his satchel and his chipped thermometer, tapping mortar joints, marking frost cracks with chalk. But he spent an hour each afternoon in the chamber with Mara, teaching her the things he had spent a lifetime learning from stone. He showed her how to read mortar cracks. A horizontal crack meant settlement. A vertical crack meant frost. A diagonal crack meant the stone was shifting under load. He showed her how water stains on the wall told the history of every flood and thaw the chamber had ever experienced. He showed her that the temperature gradient in the shaft was not even. The lowest 10 feet were warmest, the upper 10 feet were coldest, and the middle 10 feet were where the 2 climates met and fought. "If you must choose," Tobin said, "always choose depth over shelter. A shallow cave with a fire will lose to a deep hole without one, because fire is temporary and the earth is not." Mara filed every lesson the way she filed everything, silently, completely, without the outward signs of learning that teachers usually require. Tobin did not require them. He was accustomed to students who did not thank him, because Stone never thanked him either, and it was the best student he had ever had. On the 4th day, the telegraph line went dead. On the 5th day, the fog filled the gorge. Not morning fog that burns off by noon, but a thick, gray, wet fog that settled into the granite, cut like something poured. The arches of the viaduct disappeared. The depot disappeared. The sky disappeared. Mara stood at the hatch opening and could not see 15 feet in any direction. She tested the chamber one final time. She closed the hatch, descended to the bottom, and sat with Tobin's cracked thermometer held at arm's length. After 1 hour, the reading was 52 degrees. She opened the hatch, climbed to the surface, and felt the wind bite into her face with a cold that made her eyes water and her lungs seize. The contrast was so sharp it felt like stepping between two different seasons. Clegg still refused to believe it. Mara found him at the depot that evening and told him the number. 52 degrees. Clegg shook his head. "A bridge can carry a train," he said again. The same words, the same rhythm, the same flat certainty. It cannot carry a life. Tobin, who had followed Mara to the depot to collect his day's ration of coffee, answered without looking up from his cup. "You never asked what else it was carrying," he said. Clegg did not reply, but he wrote the number on the back of a freight receipt and put it in his pocket. On the 6th day, the blizzard came. It did not arrive the way storms arrive in stories, building slowly, announcing themselves with drama. It arrived the way death arrives in winter, suddenly, completely, and without the courtesy of a warning that matched the scale of what was coming. 1 hour the fog was thick and still. The next hour, the fog was moving. The hour after that, the fog was gone, and the wind had replaced it, and the wind brought snow that did not fall so much as fly, horizontal, dry, fine as sand, driven with a force that turned every exposed surface into a scouring plain. The gorge became a wind tunnel. The arches of the viaduct channeled the gusts into a concentrated blast that stripped the snow from the gorge floor and threw it against the far wall in waves. Visibility dropped to nothing. The sound was not wind anymore. It was noise, a roar without direction, without rhythm, without pause, filling every space so completely that thinking became an act of resistance. Mara was in the chamber when it hit. She had gone below at the first shift in the fog, carrying the last of the biscuit crumbs and a cup of water she had melted from clean snow. Tobin had left Split Pine the previous evening on the last work train before the line closed, promising to return when the storm broke. He had left his pocket thermometer with her and a half-dozen candle stubs from his satchel. She was alone. For the first 2 hours, the chamber held. The temperature at the bottom stayed near 50 degrees. The hatch seal flexed under the wind pressure, but did not fail. The draft through the finger-width gap was steady, a thin, cold whisper that she could feel on her cheek if she stood near the shaft, but that did not penetrate to the lower chamber. She lit a candle and watched the flame. It stood almost straight. The air was still. Then the hatch banged open. Not the wind. The wind could not lift the hatch from above. The drift was already building over it, pressing it down. Something had pulled it from outside. Mara heard boots on iron, clumsy and sliding, and then a voice, thin, cracked, terrified, calling down into the shaft. "Is someone there? Please! Is someone there?" Amos Reed was 12 years old, small for his age, and burning with a fever that made his eyes bright and his thinking slow. He had been on the same placement train as Mara, different car, different destination, and had been placed with a section foreman's family near the next depot east. The placement had lasted 3 weeks before Amos walked away in the night, following the track west because west was the only direction that did not lead back to where he had been. He had arrived at Split Pine 2 days earlier, hiding in the freight shed, eating nothing, speaking to no one. When the blizzard hit, he had watched Mara disappear into the ground and followed her trail to the hatch. Mara climbed. She found him at the top of the shaft, crouching on the iron rim, shaking so hard his teeth made a sound like pebbles in a cup. His coat was soaked. His hands were bare. He had no hat, no scarf, no gloves. The wind was tearing at him with a force that threatened to peel him off the rim and throw him into the gorge. She grabbed his arm and pulled him onto the ladder. "Hold the rungs," she said. "Do not let go. Do not look down." "I cannot see," Amos said. "You do not need to see. You need to hold." She guided him down one rung at a time. His hands slipped twice. His feet missed a rung once, and his weight swung out over the shaft, and Mara caught his coat collar and hauled him back against the stone with a strength that came from somewhere she did not know she had. At the bottom, he collapsed on the platform and curled into himself like a wounded animal. The chamber was not built for two. One body in the space was manageable. Two bodies meant more heat generated, but also more oxygen consumed, more moisture exhaled, more space occupied. The sleeping platform that had held one person comfortably now held one person and a sick child pressed together, and the mathematics of survival had changed. Mara closed the hatch, or tried to. The wind was driving snow into the shaft at an angle, and the hatch would not seat properly. She climbed halfway up and forced it down, packing snow around the edges with her bare hands until the seal held. The effort cost her 10 minutes of exposure and left her fingers white and numb. Below, Amos was shaking. Not the shaking of cold alone. This was the shaking of fever, the body fighting something internal while the external world conspired to finish the job. His forehead, when she touched it, was burning. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He needed warmth, water, rest, and a doctor, and she could provide exactly one of those things. She wrapped him in the flannel strip and the burlap in her own coat, keeping only her wool skirt and the bread paper bandage on her hand. She lay beside him on the platform, with her back against the stone wall and her body between his and the sump side of the chamber, so that if he rolled in his fever, he would roll against her and not into the water. "Count the stones," she told him. "What?" "The stones in the wall. Start at the ladder and count them. Touch each one." "Why?" "Because counting is something to do, and doing something is how you stay awake, and staying awake is how you do not die." Amos counted. His voice was a whisper, and the numbers were uneven: 7, 8, 11. He skipped 9 and circled back, but the counting kept his mind working, and working minds did not slide into the quiet place where cold and fever met, and sleep became permanent. The candle burned. The flame stood straight. The thermometer read 51 degrees. Then Mara heard it. A sound from above, not wind, not snow, but metal. A sharp, ringing strike, iron against iron, and then a second strike, and then silence. She knew that sound. She had spent 3 weeks in a rail camp listening to men hammer spikes, and the sound of iron hitting iron was as familiar as her own heartbeat. Someone was at the hatch. Someone was hammering something into the hasp. Rufus Dane had found her. He had reached the viaduct before the worst of the blizzard pinned him at the depot. He had seen the hatch chain loose. Mara had left it unlatched so she could open it from below, and he had read the situation with the efficient cruelty of a man who understood that control mattered more than mercy. A girl in a crawl space was a retrieval. A girl sealed underground was a problem that solved itself, and problems that solved themselves did not ask questions about bruises or ledger entries. He drove a spare spike through the hasp with a rock. Inside the chamber, Mara heard the second strike and understood. The hatch was locked from the outside. The refuge had become a cell. She and Amos were sealed in a stone chamber 30 feet below a blizzard with a locked iron door above them, and the man who locked it did not care whether they survived. If you need to know what happens next, and how a locked hatch, a sick child, and a blizzard that has not yet peaked become a story of survival. Hit subscribe now, because this is the moment everything changes. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury for people who had options, and Mara had learned long ago that the absence of options was its own kind of clarity. The hatch was locked. She could not change that. The storm was raging. She could not change that. Amos was sick. She could not change that either. What she could change was what happened inside the chamber. And inside the chamber, she was still in control. She rationed what she had. The biscuit crumbs went to Amos. His body needed fuel more than hers. The water in the tin cup she divided into sips, one for him every hour, one for her every 2 hours. The candle she burned for 10 minutes at a time, checking the air, checking the thermometer, checking Amos's color in the flickering light. She tore her petticoat into strips and wrapped his hands. She pressed his back against the warmest section of wall, the lower portion, where the earth's steady heat was strongest. She kept him talking when she could, and counting when she could not. And when he slept, she counted for him, touching each stone in the wall with her fingertip to keep her own mind anchored in the physical world. The hours passed like stone, slow, heavy, and indifferent. Above them, the blizzard reached its full force. Mara could not hear it from the bottom of the chamber, but she could feel it in the small ways that the air changed. A pulse of pressure when a gust hit the hatch, a faint vibration through the stone when the wind found a frequency that matched the viaduct's mass. The bridge was singing, a low bass note that she felt in her teeth more than heard with her ears, and it did not stop. Outside, the gorge was impassable. Snow had filled the gap between the arches to a depth of 6 feet in places, and the wind was packing it into a density that would require picks, not shovels. The track on both sides of the viaduct was buried. The telegraph was dead. The depot was sealed. Clegg kept the stove burning and the lamp lit and waited for something he could not yet name. It was Nell who broke first. She appeared at Clegg's door after dark on the first night, her face raw from the wind, her hands shaking, and asked the question that nobody else had asked. Did the girl get below before the hatch closed? Clegg did not know. Dane went to the bridge, Nell said, before the worst of it. He went to the bridge and came back smiling. Clegg looked at her. The word smiling sat in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water. Smiling, Clegg repeated. Smiling. Clegg put on his coat. Nell put on hers. They did not discuss what they were going to do, because what they were going to do depended on whether they could reach the bridge at all, and the storm had opinions about that. They made it 40 yards from the depot before the wind drove them back. They tried again from the south embankment, crawling below the wind line, and made it to the second arch before a gust pinned Nell flat against the stone, and Clegg lost feeling in his right hand. They retreated. Tobin Vale was not at Split Pine. He was 30 miles east, stalled at a section house where the work train had been stopped by drifts across the track. He did not know about Amos. He did not know about the locked hatch. He knew only that the storm was the worst he had seen in 14 years in Dakota, and that somewhere in the gorge a girl was trying to live inside stone. The rescue engine was ordered out from the division yard on the second morning. The line superintendent had received a garbled telegraph message before the wire died, something about stranded workers at Split Pine, and dispatched a locomotive with a snowplow and a crew of 8. The crew fought the drifts the way railroad men fought drifts in 1888, with picks, shovels, and profanity. They cleared a mile of track, hit a drift that buried the plow to its headlight, dug it out, cleared another half mile, and hit a second drift. Progress was measured in yards per hour. A railroad laborer named Ott Priestman, who had tried to walk the track from the next section house east, was found alive beneath a snow fence with frostbitten feet and hands. He had survived by crawling under the fence boards and letting the snow bury him, the same principle, in crude form, that Mara was using 30 feet below ground. But Priestman had no stone mass to hold warmth, and the snow insulation was uneven, and his feet would cost him 4 toes on each side. He lived. The price was visible. Inside the chamber, the second day was worse than the first. Amos's fever climbed. He stopped counting and started talking, fragments of sentences that did not connect, names Mara did not recognize, descriptions of places she had never seen. Fever talk, the language of a mind trying to find solid ground while the body underneath it burned. Mara kept him warm. She kept him hydrated with sip-sized rations from the tin cup. Refilled from the sump seep, the water was gritty with mineral residue, but it was not frozen, and it was not poisoned, and it was wet. She kept the candle usage to 5 minutes per hour, just enough to check the thermometer and confirm the air was breathable. 51 degrees, 50 degrees, 49. The temperature was dropping slowly as the surface cold worked its way deeper through the stone. But the drop was measured in degrees per day, not degrees per hour, and the mass of earth and granite around them was fighting a slow, patient battle against the blizzard's assault. The chamber did not make them comfortable. Mara's back ached from the stone. Her hands were raw and swollen. Her stomach was empty. The biscuit crumbs were gone, and the only food left was the hope that the storm would end before her body stopped converting hope into heat. Amos whimpered in his sleep and pressed against her side, and she held him the way she had never been held, with the fierce, mechanical tenderness of someone who understood that the child against her ribs was the difference between a girl surviving alone and a person surviving for a reason. On the second evening she felt it, not through her ears, through the stone. A vibration in the wall behind her back, rhythmic, distant, growing. The low pulse of weight moving on iron, transmitted through rail and bridge and pier and foundation into the chamber where she sat with a sick child and a dying candle. The rescue locomotive was on the viaduct. Mara climbed the ladder. At the top, she pressed her shoulder against the hatch and pushed. It did not move. The spike through the hasp held it shut, and the snow above added weight, and her arms had been weakened by 2 days of cold and hunger and the constant grinding effort of keeping 2 bodies alive in a stone box. She pushed harder. The hatch shifted a fraction of an inch. She could see light through the gap, not daylight exactly, but the diffused glow of fog lit from within. The storm had broken. The wind had dropped. The snow had stopped. And somewhere above and to the east, a headlight was cutting through the fog like a blade through gauze. Tobin's voice came back to her. Metal shrinks in cold. Ice grips edges. Force alone wastes strength. She unwrapped the flannel from Amos's hands. He moaned but did not wake, and pressed it against the hinge side of the hatch, holding it there with her bare palm, letting her body heat conduct through the cloth into the iron. 1 minute. 2. She felt the frost on the hinge begin to soften. She worked the broken awl under the rim, prying at the ice that had sealed the edges, chipping at the frozen gravel in the channel the same way she had chipped at it 6 days ago when the hatch was just a mystery and not a locked door. The headlight grew brighter. She could hear the engine now, not through the stone, but through the air, the chuff and hiss of steam cutting through fog. The locomotive was crossing the viaduct. It was above her. Mara braced her feet on the top rung and drove her shoulder into the hatch with everything she had left. The spike bent. The hasp cracked. The hatch burst open, and snow cascaded into the shaft, and Mara's head and shoulders came through into air that was so cold it burned her lungs and so bright, even in fog, that her eyes closed involuntarily against the whiteness. She saw the headlight first, a yellow-white bloom in the gray air, moving slowly across the viaduct, enormous and impossibly close. The locomotive was 30 yards away, pushing a wall of snow, and the fog made the light look like something alive, a single eye searching the gorge for whatever was left to find. Mara stood in the hatch opening. She raised her arms. She did not shout because her voice had been used up over 2 days of counting and whispering and keeping a child anchored to the world. The engineer saw her. Later, the brakeman would say that the first thing he noticed was the steam, not from the engine, from the shaft, warm air rising from the open hatch into freezing fog, a thin column of vapor that looked like smoke from a fire that had no fuel. He said it was the strangest thing he had seen in 18 years of railroad work, a girl standing in a hole in the ground beside a bridge pier, steam rising around her like she had climbed out of the earth itself. Mara pointed down the shaft. "There is a boy," she said. "He is sick. He needs a doctor." The crew pulled Amos out first. He was limp, feverish, but alive, his pulse weak and his skin hot enough to feel through his soaked coat. They wrapped him in blankets from the caboose and carried him across the viaduct on a stretcher improvised from a door and 2 shovels. Then they pulled Mara out. She stood on the snow, swaying, and the fog closed around the headlight behind her, and for a moment she was just a shape in white air, one mitten, cracked hands, alive. Clegg was waiting at the depot. He had been waiting since Nell told him about Dane's smile, and the waiting had done something to his face that Mara would later recognize as the look of a man who had changed his mind about something and did not yet know what to do with the change. He looked at her. He looked at the blanket-wrapped shape of Amos being carried past. He looked at the fog filling the gorge where the hatch was still open, still breathing warm air into the frozen world. Then he turned toward the depot, where Rufus Dane was standing near the stove with his ledger under his arm, and asked the question that would begin the unraveling of everything Dine had built. "Whose names are in that book?" The locomotive engineer was the first outsider to descend the ladder. His name was Gus Fenton, and he had been driving engines on the Dakota branch for 9 years, and he had never once considered what lay beneath the bridges he crossed every week. He went down because the brakeman told him about the steam, and because a girl who climbed out of the ground during a blizzard was either a liar or a miracle, and Gus Fenton did not believe in miracles, but he did believe in things he could measure. He carried a lantern. The shaft swallowed the light for the first 10 feet, where the stone was still crusted with ice from the hatch opening. Then the light steadied. The air changed. By the time Fenton reached the bottom, he had already unbuttoned his coat. He stood in the chamber for a long time. He looked at the platform. He looked at the stone line along the sump. He looked at the chalk marks on the wall, Mara's scratch lines layered over Tobin's old inspection notes, and at the tin cup hanging on the rusted bolt. He held his lantern near the lower wall and felt the warmth that had kept 2 children alive for 2 days, while the surface temperature tried to kill everything that breathed. "Ah, this is warmer than the caboose," Fenton said when he climbed back to the surface. He said it to Clegg. He said it the way a man says something that has rearranged a piece of his understanding, not with amazement, but with the flat tone of someone accepting a fact that should have been obvious. Clegg heard him. Clegg had been hearing things since the storm broke, things he should have heard earlier, things he had dismissed because dismissing them was easier than recalculating. The girl's question about how deep the piers went, Tobin's comment about what else the bridge was carrying, Nell's report about Dane's smile, each one a signal he had received and set aside because his verdict had already been delivered, and revising a verdict required admitting the original was wrong. He went down the ladder himself that afternoon. The chamber was empty now. Mara was at the depot, wrapped in a blanket, drinking broth that Nell had made from dried beef and boiled snow. Amos was in the boarding house under a pile of quilts, his fever breaking slowly, his hands bandaged with clean cloth. The crisis was over. The evidence remained. Clegg held Tobin's cracked thermometer at arm's length. 51 degrees. The storm had ended 8 hours ago, and the surface temperature was still 9 below zero with wind, and the lower chamber was 51 degrees, a difference of 60 degrees between the world above and the world below. He climbed back to the surface and found Mara at the depot. She was sitting near the stove, and she did not look like a person who had survived something extraordinary. She looked like a person who had been working for 2 days without food or sleep and wanted to be left alone. Her hands were wrapped in clean bandages that Nell had applied with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had treated frostbite before. Her face was drawn. Her eyes were steady. "I said a bridge could not carry a life," Clegg said. "I was wrong." Mara looked at him. She did not say, "I told you so," because she had not told him so. She had not argued with his verdict at all. She had simply acted as if the verdict did not apply to her, which was a different thing, and Clegg was beginning to understand, a more dangerous one. "It is not the bridge," Mara said. "It is the ground underneath the bridge. The stone holds heat the way a stove holds coals, slowly. The air down there does not know what the air up here is doing." "How did you know that?" "A man named Tobin Vale showed me. He pressed my hand against a culvert wall and told me to feel. I felt it." Clegg nodded. He was a man who understood tools, and he recognized that Mara had used a tool he had not known existed, the thermal mass of the earth itself, accessed through a hole that the railroad had built for another purpose entirely. He did not yet respect her the way he would later. But he had stopped dismissing her, and in a frontier settlement, the distance between dismissal and respect was shorter than most people thought. The question started that evening. Not from kindness. The storm had frightened people, and frightened people wanted information before they wanted sentiment. The section foreman's wife came first. She was a practical woman who had spent every blizzard of the last 4 winters huddled in a cabin with green wood smoking in the stove and ice forming on the inside of the windows. "How far down?" she asked. 30 feet, Mara said. "How much air?" "Enough for 2 people and a candle if you leave a finger-width gap in the hatch seal." "Could children fit?" "A 12-year-old boy fit. He's in the boarding house now." The depot hand came next. He wanted to know whether a brakeman could find the hatch in a whiteout. Mara said no, not without a guide rope. The hatch was invisible under drift snow. You needed a fixed line from a known point to the hatch ring, and the line needed to be something you could feel in the dark, not something you could see. The freight loader wanted to know if the hatch could freeze shut again. Mara said yes. It would freeze shut every time the temperature dropped below zero, unless the seam was kept clear or the iron was treated with grease. And even then, a determined man with a spike could lock it from outside. She said that last part looking at Clegg. Clegg understood. Nell Birtle came to the chamber on the 3rd day after the storm. She did not announce herself. She descended the ladder with the caution of a woman who did not trust the ground to hold her, and she stood at the bottom with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and looked at the space that had kept alive the girl she had called strange. "I told you stone was for graves," Nell said. "You did," Mara said. "I was wrong." "You were practical. Practical is not the same as wrong. It is just slower." Nell almost smiled. She uncrossed her arms and touched the wall, the way Tobin had taught Mara to touch it, palm flat, fingers spread, feeling for the warmth that lived in the grain. Her eyes widened slightly. Not much. Just enough to tell Mara that the wall had said something Nell had not expected to hear. "It is warm," Nell said, with the surprise of a woman who had lived 4 years next to a bridge and never once touched its foundations. "It is always warm down here," Mara said. "The cold cannot reach this deep, not in January, not in February, not in the worst storm you have ever seen. The earth changes slowly. That is the secret. Everyone looks up for shelter, walls, roofs, stovepipes. Nobody looks down." Nell studied the chamber the way she studied a kitchen, assessing what worked, what was missing, what could be improved. She pointed at the sleeping platform. "That is too narrow for a grown man. It was built for one girl. It can be widened. The sump needs a cover, a proper one, not loose stones." "I know. And the hatch needs a latch on the inside, so that nobody can lock it from above again." That last sentence carried weight that had nothing to do with engineering. Nell was not talking about hatches. She was talking about Dane. She was talking about a system that gave men the authority to lock children underground and call it discipline. The latch was Nell's answer to a question she had been asking herself for years, and the answer was simple. You build the lock on the side where the people are. Mara shared everything she knew. She did not hoard knowledge or trade it for favors, because she had learned from Tobin that knowledge kept private was only cleverness, and cleverness had never kept anyone warm. She marked the hatch with a painted white ring, a circle of whitewash on the stone that could be seen from 20 feet in daylight and felt with a gloved hand in darkness. Tobin, who had returned to Split Pine on the first train after the line reopened, helped her hang a bell wire from the lower chamber to the underside of the arch. If someone was trapped below and needed help, they could ring the wire and the sound would carry along the stone. Nell sewed red cloth streamers onto a guide rope, a 30-foot length of hemp that ran from a bolt in the arch base to the hatch ring. In a whiteout, you could not see red cloth, but you could feel it. The streamers were spaced 3 feet apart, and each one had a knot beneath it that told you how far you were from the hatch. 3 knots meant 9 feet. 5 knots meant 15. At 7 knots, your hand was on the ring. The comparison was measurable. During the blizzard, a section shack near the siding had frozen so hard that a water crock inside it split open from the expansion of the ice. The wood stove in the boarding house had consumed 3/4 of a cord of wood in 2 days and still failed to keep the temperature above 40 degrees in the back rooms. A freight car standing on the spur had its brake lines frozen solid and its iron wheels bonded to the rail by ice. The lower chamber had held above 50 degrees without fuel. The difference was not magic. It was not luck. It was still air plus stone mass plus depth, 3 factors that the earth provided for free to anyone who knew to ask. Rufus Dane did not participate in the asking. He spent the days after the storm in the boarding house, keeping to his room, emerging only for meals that he ate in silence. His ledger remained under his arm. His overcoat remained brushed. But something in his posture had changed, a tightness in the shoulders, a quickness in the eyes, that Mara recognized because she had seen it in every institutional authority figure who felt control slipping. Dane was not afraid of the cold, or the bridge, or the chamber. He was afraid of the boy in the boarding house who was getting well enough to talk. Amos Reed was recovering. His fever had broken on the 2nd day after the rescue, and by the 4th day he was sitting up, eating Nell's biscuits, and answering questions in a voice that was still thin but no longer wandering. He told Clegg about the placement. He told Clegg about walking the track at night. He told Clegg about watching Mara disappear into the ground and following because the ground seemed safer than the surface. And he told Clegg about the hatch. "The man in the black coat came to the bridge," Amos said. "I was on the ladder. I heard him. He hit something with a rock. Then the door would not open anymore." Clegg wrote it down. He wrote it on the back of the same freight receipt where he had written the thermometer reading, and he put both papers in the lockbox behind his desk. Dine tried to reshape the story before it hardened. The girl trespassed on company property, he told the depot hand. She endangered a child by luring him underground during a blizzard. If anyone should be held accountable, it is the runaway who created the situation. The depot hand listened. He had spent 2 days digging snow from the track, and he had seen odd policemen carried past on a door with 4 black toes on each foot, and he was not in a mood to hear a man in a clean coat explain accountability. She did not lock the hatch, the depot hand said. Who locked the hatch? Diane did not answer. He retreated to his room and began writing letters. Tobin Vale returned to Split Pine with purpose. He had spent the storm days at the section house thinking about the chamber and about the girl who had understood its value before anyone else, and he had arrived at a conclusion that surprised him. He wanted to make the chamber better, not as an assignment. Not because the railroad had asked, because a space that had saved 2 lives deserved to be treated as something more than an accident. He and Mara worked together through the last weeks of January and into February. The collaboration was unlike anything either of them had experienced. Tobin brought engineering knowledge, the ability to read stone and mortar, and load-bearing capacity, the trained eye that could look at a crack and tell you whether it was stable or moving. Mara brought survivor knowledge, the understanding of what a frightened person needed in a dark, enclosed space, the awareness that a shelter which worked for an experienced mason might kill a panicked child. They disagreed early and often. Tobin wanted to widen the shaft opening for easier access. Mara refused. A wider opening meant more draft, more heat loss, and more visibility from the surface. She wanted the chamber to remain hidden because the thing that had nearly killed her was not the cold, but a man with a spike and a hasp. Tobin argued that safety required accessibility. Mara argued that accessibility without security was a trap, not a shelter. "You think like a person who has been hunted," Tobin said one afternoon, squatting in the chamber with a chalk stick in his hand and a sketch of the proposed modifications on the wall. "I have been hunted," Mara said. "You have not. That is why you trust doors and I trust depth." The argument was never fully resolved. They compromised. The shaft opening would stay narrow, but a second latch would be installed on the inside, a heavy iron bar that could be thrown from the ladder, locking the hatch against any attempt to seal it from above. The modification cost Tobin 2 days of metalwork using tools borrowed from the section foreman's shop, and when it was done, Mara tested it herself. She descended through the bar and invited Tobin to try the hatch from outside. He could not move it. "Now it is a shelter," Mara said. Tobin's backstory emerged the way backstories emerge between people who work together in confined spaces, in fragments, between tasks, offered without preamble and received without comment. He had been born in Merthyr Tydfil, in the coal valleys of South Wales, and had started in the quarries at 14. He had come to America at 26 because the Welsh quarries were killing men at a rate that made the American railroads look gentle. He had married once, briefly, to a woman who died of typhoid in Pittsburgh. He had no children. He had stone. "I never liked the surface much," he told Mara one evening, sitting on the chamber floor with his bad ankle stretched out and a candle between them. "Too much weather. Too many people with opinions. Down here, the stone has opinions too, but they are slower and more honest." Mara understood this better than she could explain. She had spent her life among people who formed judgments quickly and discarded them slowly, and the stone's patience, its willingness to hold warmth for months, to change temperature in degrees per week instead of degrees per hour, felt like the first trustworthy thing she had encountered since her mother's hands. Tobin's cough started in the first week of February. He blamed it on the cold. Then he blamed it on the dust from the mortar work. Then he stopped blaming it on anything and simply coughed, deep and wet, in a way that made Mara's chest tighten every time she heard it. He had spent too many hours in the gorge during the storm aftermath, working in wind and wet without adequate clothing, and his lungs were 63 years old and had been breathing quarry dust since he was a boy. Pneumonia settled into him the way cold settles into stone, slowly, deeply, and with a patience that made resistance feel futile. He continued working for a week after the cough started, moving slower each day, resting more often, leaning on the wall between tasks. Mara watched him weaken and said nothing because she recognized the same stubbornness in him that other people recognized in her, and she knew that telling a stubborn person to stop was the surest way to make them work harder. He collapsed on the 12th of February in the chamber while demonstrating how to read water stains on the foundation wall. One moment he was pointing at a tide mark that indicated the highest flood level in the gorge's history. The next moment he was on the floor, his face gray, his breathing shallow, his hands still extended toward the wall, as if the lesson was more important than the body delivering it. Mara got him to the surface. She did not know how. Later, she would not remember the mechanics of it, only the weight of a man on her shoulder and the sound of his breathing and the iron rungs passing under her hand one at a time. She got him to the depot. Nell took over. The nearest doctor was 7 miles east, and Clegg sent a message on the repaired telegraph line. Tobin survived, but the pneumonia did not fully release him, and the man who had descended the ladder with a chalk stick and a thermometer in January did not climb it again in February. He spent the rest of the winter in the boarding house, propped in a chair near the stove, coughing into a cloth that Nell washed each evening without comment. He lived long enough to see the chamber adopted. The branch line superintendent, pressured by Fenton's report and Clegg's increasingly insistent correspondence, issued a winter directive in late February. All accessible foundation chambers, culvert voids, and bridge abutment spaces along the split pine branch were to be surveyed and, where suitable, marked as emergency shelters. Tobin provided the specifications from his chair: minimum depth, maximum draft tolerance, required air volume per person, recommended supply caches. He dictated them to Mara, who wrote them down in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a person who had been taught to read by nuns and taught to write by necessity. His last teaching was not technical. It came on a March morning when the light through the boarding house window had the thin, hard quality of early spring, and Tobin's cough had settled into a rhythm that Mara had learned to count by. "Knowledge kept private is only cleverness," Tobin said. "Knowledge shared becomes shelter." He said it as if he had been saving the words for a specific moment, and this was the moment. And Mara heard them the way she heard everything Tobin said, completely, silently, filed in the place where the important things lived. There is a kind of grief that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with tears or collapse or the visible markers that other people recognize and respond to. It arrives as weight, a settling in the chest, a heaviness in the hands, a quality of light that looks the same as it did yesterday but feels like a room where someone has just left. Mara carried that weight through the rest of March without speaking of it, and if her hands moved a little slower when she worked the hatch seam, or if she paused sometimes on the ladder with her palm flat against the stone, feeling for the warmth that Tobin had taught her to feel, nobody mentioned it. Some kinds of listening are private. Tobin Vale died on the 29th of March in the boarding house, with Nell beside him and Mara's handwritten specifications on the table next to his chair. His hands were folded. The cracked thermometer was in his coat pocket. Nell said he had not coughed in the last hour, and that the silence had been the thing that told her. The secondary crisis came 8 days later, as if the gorge had been waiting for Mara to face it alone. In early April, A thaw broke the ice pack in the upper gorge. Meltwater swelled the creek that ran beneath the viaduct, and the runoff carried chunks of ice the size of freight crates down the narrow channel. A section of the embankment above the gorge lip gave way, not a landslide, but a slump, enough to drop 30 tons of frozen earth and gravel across the track east of the bridge. The track was blocked. The telegraph wire, recently repaired, snapped again where a tree had been undermined by melt and fallen across the poles. A maintenance crew of 4 men had been working on the bridge approach when the slide hit. They were not buried. The slide was east of their position, but they were cut off. The track behind them was blocked. The track ahead of them crossed the viaduct and descended into the gorge, where fog was rising from the warm water hitting cold air, and the visibility was dropping by the minute. Nell was with them. She had been bringing a midday meal to the section foreman when the embankment let go, and she had pressed herself flat against the bridge abutment while the earth moved past her with a sound she later described as a groan. 5 people. Fog. No telegraph. No train. Dropping temperature as the sun disappeared behind cloud cover. The thaw that had loosened the ice was ending, and the air was reverting to winter with the speed that Dakota air reverted to anything, abruptly and without negotiation. Mara reached them from the gorge side. She had heard the slide from the chamber, where she had been restocking the supply tin, dry matches, candle stubs, a twist of dried meat that Nell had contributed, and she had climbed to the surface to find the fog already thick enough to hide the arches. She carried the guide rope. If this story reminds you that the most important knowledge is the kind someone takes the time to pass on, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what Mara does next, she does with lessons from a man who is no longer there to teach them. The 4 men did not want to go underground. They were railroad workers, men who spent their lives on the surface, on iron, in open air. The idea of descending into a stone shaft beneath a bridge they walked across every day was not frightening in the way that storms were frightening. It was frightening in the way that coffins were frightening. It was the wrong direction. Mara did not argue. She handed the end of the guide rope to the nearest man, a track layer named Soren Haugen, who had been swinging a spike maul that morning and was now standing in fog with ice crystals forming on his beard, and told him to hold it. "Follow the knots," she said. 3 knots, 9 feet. 5 knots, 15 feet. 7 knots, you are at the hatch. Go down the ladder feet first. Do not look down. Count the rungs. There are 23. At the bottom, turn left. The platform is there. Do not turn right. The sump is there. Haugen looked at her. He looked at the fog. He looked at the guide rope in his hand and the red cloth streamers that he could feel but not see. "How warm is it down there?" he asked. "Warmer than you are now," Mara said. They went, one at a time, following the rope, counting the knots, descending the ladder into the dark, while Mara stood at the hatch and counted them down. Haugen first, then the 2 junior track men, then the section foreman. Nell went last. She paused at the hatch rim and looked at Mara in the fog. "Tobin would have gone first," Nell said. "Tobin is not here," Mara said. "I am." Nell descended. Mara followed, pulling the hatch closed behind her, throwing the inside latch, the iron bar that Tobin had built and she had tested, and sealing the chamber against the fog and the cold and the failing light. 5 adults and 1 17-year-old girl in a space built for 1 inspector. The air was close. The candle flame bent slightly more than usual, more lungs consuming oxygen, more bodies generating heat and moisture. Mara opened the breath gap a fraction wider and watched the flame. It steadied. The temperature held. 50 degrees in a chamber packed with 6 people, while above them the fog froze into rime on every surface, and the track disappeared under a skin of black ice. Hogan was the first to speak. "The girl was right," he said, to nobody in particular. "It is warmer than the caboose." They stayed 4 hours. The fog lifted at dusk, and a work train from the west reached them before dark, having been alerted by a signal flag that the section foreman had planted on the track before the fog closed in. When the crew climbed out, each one of them touched the guide rope on the way past, as if memorizing the feel of the knots against their palms. Mara was the last one out. She stood at the hatch and looked at the gorge, fog thinning, stone arches emerging, the faint sound of the work train's bell carrying through the cold air, and she understood something that had been forming in her since Tobin's death. The chamber was not hers. It had never been hers. It belonged to the stone and the earth and the depth, and her only job, the only job that mattered, was to make sure people could find it. She repainted the white ring that night. She checked the guide rope. She replaced the candle stubs in the supply tin. She hung Tobin's cracked thermometer on the rusted bolt next to the tin cup, where anyone who descended could read it and know. Dying tried to leave Split Pine the following week. He packed his ledger and his brushed coat and waited at the depot for the eastbound. But the eastbound brought something he had not expected: letters. 3 of them, addressed to the station master at Split Pine from families in Minnesota and Iowa whose children had been placed through Dane's circuit. The letters asked questions. They asked about bruises. They asked about a boy returned with a broken wrist and a girl returned with burns on her arms. They asked whether anyone at Split Pine had an address for the placement agent named Rufus Dane. Clegg read the letters at his desk. He read them twice. Then he locked the depot door and told Dane that the eastbound would be delayed. "You cannot hold me here," Dane said. "I have authority. I have documentation." "You have a ledger," Clegg said, "and a boy in the boarding house says you locked a hatch during a blizzard, and 3 families say their children came back hurt. You will wait for the county sheriff, or you will wait in the freight shed. Your choice." Dying chose the freight shed. It was not warm, but it was, Mara noted without speaking, above ground. Some people never learned to look down. The sheriff arrived 4 days later. Dying's ledger was entered as evidence. The neat handwriting that had recorded children like cargo now recorded something else: a pattern of placements that ended in returns, returns that ended in silence, and silences that covered injuries that no one had been required to explain. But that was the law's work, not Mara's. Her work was in the gorge, where the stone held its warmth, and the hatch stayed oiled and the guide rope hung stiff with frost, waiting for the next hand that needed to find it. The railroad did what railroads do with things they first resist and later need. It absorbed the idea, stamped it with official language, and pretended it had been the plan all along. The winter directive that the branch superintendent had issued in February, under pressure from Fenton's report, Clegg's correspondence, and the quiet threat of a story reaching the territorial newspapers, became a formal procedure by the following autumn. Split Pine Viaduct received painted refugee plates, small iron squares bolted to the bridge approach at both ends, marked with a white circle and the words, "Emergency Shelter, Hatch at Central Pier." The plates were designed in the division office by a clerk who had never descended a ladder in his life, but the specifications they referenced had been dictated by a dying Welsh mason to a 17-year-old girl, and that fact appeared nowhere in the official record. 2 culverts east of Split Pine were surveyed next. One had a maintenance void large enough for 3 people and deep enough to hold warmth. The other was too shallow and too wet, but a stone-lined chamber was excavated beside it, not by the railroad's engineering department, but by Soren Hogan and 2 of the trackmen who had spent 4 hours underground during the April fog. They dug it on their own time, with their own tools, because they had felt the warmth in the stone and did not need a directive to understand its value. A tunnel mouth west of the gorge received an emergency tin, matches, candle stubs, dried meat, wired to the wall inside the portal where a man could find it in darkness. 3 bridge abutments along the branch were assessed by Mara herself, who walked the line in October with a candle and Tobin's thermometer, testing every enclosed space for draft, temperature, and air volume. 2 of the 3 met the minimum specifications. The third was too exposed, and Mara marked it with a black X so that no one would waste time seeking shelter where shelter did not exist. The markings spread through a system that had no name and no official structure. It was simply what happened when people who had survived something told other people who might need to survive the same thing. Hogan told the section crew at the next depot east. The section crew told the freight loaders. The freight loaders told the brakemen, and the brakemen carried the knowledge up and down the branch line in the same cars that carried grain and timber and cattle. By the end of the first year, 7 shelters along the split pine branch carried red cloth markers, dry tins, and rung counts scratched into boards. Men who had laughed at the idea of a girl living under a bridge now repeated her instructions to new hires. Block the draft first, stay off wet stone, leave a breath gap for the candle, count the rungs going down so you can count them coming up. Mara taught each one personally, not because the railroad asked her to. The railroad had not yet acknowledged her existence in any official capacity, but because Tobin's last words had settled into her the way his lessons about stone had settled, deeply, permanently, and with the slow patience of something that would not be dislodged by surface weather. She taught Haugen to find the ladder in total darkness. She walked him through it 3 times, hatched to first rung with eyes closed, counting the distance in footsteps, locating the rim by touch, lowering himself by feel. The 3rd time, Haugen did it without hesitation, and Mara said nothing, which was her version of approval. She taught Clegg to test draft direction with candle smoke. She lit a stub in the upper shaft and held it at each seam until the flame told them where the air was moving. Clegg watched with the focused attention of a man who was learning something he should have known years ago and was determined not to waste the education. She taught Nell to rig the guide rope in conditions where her hands would be numb and her eyes would be useless. They practiced in the dark, working by touch alone, threading the rope through the bolt and securing it with a knot that could be tied with frozen fingers. Nell's knots were better than Mara's by the 3rd attempt, because Nell had spent 20 years tying things in kitchens where speed mattered more than elegance. She taught Amos to count rungs slowly so that panic did not outrun breath. Amos, who had turned 13 in the boarding house and whose fever had left him thin but stubbornly alive, descended the ladder with Mara beside him and counted each rung in a voice that did not waver. At the bottom, he placed his palm against the warm stone the way Tobin had once placed Mara's palm against a culvert wall, and he held it there for a long time without speaking. "It remembers summer," Amos said. Mara looked at him. It was the first time anyone had repeated Tobin's understanding without being taught the words, and the sound of it, coming from a child's mouth in a stone chamber 30 feet underground, was the closest thing to an echo she had ever heard. The teaching changed her, not in the way that stories usually describe change. There was no sudden revelation, no moment of clarity, no inspirational speech delivered to a gathered crowd. The change was structural, the way frost changes stone, slowly, from the inside, by filling spaces that had been empty and expanding until the shape was different. She had arrived at Split Pine as a girl who survived by keeping quiet and keeping moving. She was becoming a person who survived by making sure other people could survive too. The difference was not visible from the outside. From the outside, she looked the same, thin, steady, quiet, with hands that were always working and eyes that were always measuring. The difference was in the direction of the work. It pointed outward now. Rufus Dane's resolution came in stages, each one smaller than the last, until the man who had carried a ledger and a brushed coat and the authority to move children across a continent was reduced to a figure standing in a freight shed, while his own records were read back to him by a county sheriff who did not hurry. The ledger was the center of it. Dane had kept meticulous records, names, dates, placements, returns, because meticulous records were the armor of a bureaucrat, the proof that everything had been done properly even when nothing had. But meticulous records, when read by someone who knew what to look for, were also a map of everything that had gone wrong. The sheriff, a quiet man named Kittredge, who had no particular interest in orphan trains and a considerable interest in locked hatches during blizzards, read the ledger entry by entry with Clegg beside him. The pattern was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was ordinary. Children placed with families who had requested labor, not children. Returns annotated with phrases like unsuitable temperament and failed to adjust. That, when cross-referenced with the letters from Minnesota and Iowa, translated into bruises, broken bones, and burns that no one had been required to explain because the system did not require explanations. It required entries. And Dane had provided entries. Amos testified. He sat in Clegg's office with Nell beside him and told the sheriff about the placement, about the work, about the night he walked away. He told them about arriving at Split Pine and hiding in the freight shed. He told them about following Mara to the hatch during the blizzard. And he told them about the sound of iron striking iron while he was on the ladder and the hatch that would not open after that. Nell identified one entry in the ledger, a girl listed as placed successful, who had been returned 6 weeks later to a different depot with injuries that Nell had treated herself. The girl's name was in the ledger. The injuries were not. The discrepancy was small in the way that lies are always small when measured against the paper they are printed on, and enormous in the way that lies are always enormous when measured against the body of a child. Dane was not destroyed in the way that frontier stories destroy villains, with gunfire or collapse or a final cinematic confrontation. He was reduced. The process was legal, slow, and public in the way that small-town legal processes were public in 1888. Everyone knew, everyone watched, and the watching was the punishment that preceded whatever the court eventually decided. Kittredge took the ledger. He took the letters. He took Amos's statement and Nell's identification and Clegg's account of Dane's movements during the blizzard. And then he put Dane on the eastbound under escort, not in handcuffs, that would come later, if the territorial court found cause, but with the unmistakable posture of a man being removed rather than departing. Diane's last words at Split Pine were directed at no one in particular and everyone within hearing. "No jury will trust a runaway girl," he said. His voice was steady. His coat was brushed. His ledger was gone. Clegg answered. He used the same words he had used on the first day, when Mara was crouching behind freight barrels and the storm was still days away. But the words had changed direction, the way a river changes direction when the ground beneath it shifts. "You do not have a discipline problem, Dane," Clegg said. "You have a burial problem." Dane did not respond. The eastbound pulled away, and the sound of its whistle thinned and disappeared into the cold air, and Split Pine was lighter by one man and one ledger, and the accumulated weight of the silence that had protected them both. The telegraph operator at Split Pine was a young man named Levi Mott. He was 22, thin-wristed, with a scar across his left eyebrow from a childhood fall and a habit of tapping rhythms on any flat surface within reach. Tabletops, windowsills, his own knee, as if his fingers were always practicing code even when the key was silent. He had been at Split Pine for 8 months, having transferred from a busier office in Bismarck because he preferred the quiet, and he had watched the events of that winter from the telegraph shack with the particular clarity of a man whose job was to receive and transmit information without adding to it. He had seen Mara arrive. He had seen Dane arrive. He had heard the gossip and transmitted the messages and kept his mouth shut because keeping his mouth shut was what telegraph operators did. They were conduits, not participants. But he had also done something that nobody knew about until much later. During the blizzard, when the wire was dead and no messages could be sent, he had written a report in his own hand, not a telegraph form, but a letter describing what he had observed. Diane's movements, the timing of his departure toward the bridge, the timing of his return, the expression on his face. He had given the letter to Kittredge during the sheriff's visit, and it had become part of the record that accompanied Dane east. He had not told Mara. He had not told anyone. He had simply done what his training told him to do: observe, record, transmit. Mara met him properly in April, after Tobin's death and Dane's departure, when the gorge was softening into something that resembled spring, mud, and meltwater, and the faint, tentative smell of things thawing. She had come to the telegraph shack to ask whether a message could be sent to the section house where Tobin had been stalled during the blizzard, because Tobin had left a satchel there and she wanted to retrieve it. Levi took the message and tapped it out, and then he asked her a question that no one at Split Pine had asked. "Would you like me to show you how the code works?" It was not a romantic overture. It was a professional offer from a man who recognized that a girl who had taught herself to read stone and survive underground might be interested in a system that turned language into patterns. Mara said yes. She came back the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and the afternoons accumulated into weeks, and the weeks accumulated into a rhythm that neither of them named because naming it would have required acknowledging that it was something other than code practice. Levi taught Mara to read the key, the clicks and pauses that carried messages along the wire. Mara taught Levi to read the guide rope, the knots and streamers that carried people through the dark. The exchange was symmetrical in a way that pleased them both. Two systems of navigation, one for information and one for bodies, each one useless without the knowledge of how to interpret it. Their partnership developed through shared work in the way that frontier partnerships often developed, not through courtship rituals or declared intentions, but through the slow accumulation of competence recognized and respected. Levi began sending messages on Mara's behalf, requests for supply tins, inquiries about bridge specifications along connecting branch lines, reports on shelter conditions that the railroad's division office had not asked for but could not ignore once they arrived on official telegraph forms. Mara began keeping the shack stove lit during her visits, and then during Levi's absences, and then during storms, until the arrangement was no longer an arrangement but a fact of daily life that everyone at Split Pine accepted without discussion. They married in the autumn of 1889 in the depot, with Clegg presiding because there was no minister at Split Pine, and Clegg had the authority of a notary public, which was close enough. Nell baked something she called a cake, but which was, by her own admission, closer to a biscuit with aspirations. Amos stood beside Mara and held the ring, which was a bent telegraph wire that Levi had shaped with pliers and polished with emery cloth. The years compress the way years always compress, when the urgency of survival gives way to the steadiness of building. Mara was appointed paid bridge watch in the spring of 1890, the first woman to hold the position on the branch line, and possibly the first on any branch line in the territory, though no one kept records of that kind, and Mara did not ask. She maintained the refuge shelters, inspected the hatches, restocked the supply tins, and trained every new hire who came to Split Pine in the winter months. She and Levi raised 2 children, a daughter born in 1891 and a son born in 1893, in a cabin that Haugen and the section crew built on the embankment above the gorge, close enough to the viaduct that Mara could see the white ring on the central pier from her kitchen window. The cabin was small and drafty and required more firewood than Mara would have liked, and she sometimes noted, with the dry humor that had replaced her earlier silence, that the chamber below the bridge was warmer than the house above it. They also fostered children. Not through the placement system. The placement system was undergoing reforms that moved slowly and unevenly through the territories, but through the informal network of depot agents, boarding house keepers, and telegraph operators who knew which children needed somewhere to go and which adults could be trusted to take them. Mara favored the older girls, the ones marked difficult or unsuitable, because she recognized in their silence and their stubbornness the same qualities that had kept her alive. Each one, on their first night, was taken to the chamber, not to sleep in it, the cabin had beds, but to stand in it in the warm dark with their hand on the stone and understand what Mara had understood at 17, that the earth held warmth even when everything above it had forgotten, and that knowing where to find it was the difference between being at the mercy of the surface and having a choice. Amos Reed stayed at Split Pine. He grew into a quiet, steady young man who worked the section crew and eventually became the foreman, the same position held by the man whose house he had walked away from 3 years earlier. He never married. He never fully left the orbit of the gorge. Once a year, on the anniversary of the blizzard, he descended the ladder and sat in the chamber alone for an hour. Nell asked him once what he did down there. He said he counted the stones. The community around the viaduct changed in the visible, specific ways that communities change when a single idea takes root and grows. Clegg kept Tobin's cracked thermometer behind the depot counter, and when new arrivals asked what it was for, he told them about the chamber in a voice that had lost its earlier flatness and gained something that might have been pride, though Clegg would not have used that word. Nell stored spare mittens near the boarding house stove, a dozen pairs collected from travelers and freight shipments, and the occasional deliberate purchase, so that no child arriving at Split Pine in winter would have only one. The railroad posted a winter rule on the depot wall. No worker enters the gorge during storm season without knowing the nearest marked refuge. The letters were painted by Haugen, who had the steadiest hand on the section crew, and the paint was red because Mara said red was the color you could feel in the dark. Haugen did not ask what that meant. He understood it the way he understood the guide rope. Not logically, but through the hands. The Split Pine shelters were never formally named. The division office called them Foundation Refugee Points in the Winter Directive. The section crews called them the Lower Rooms. The children Mara fostered called them by whatever private names children give to places that feel safe. The term that stuck, the one that Clegg used in his correspondence and Nell used in conversation, and the brakemen used when they passed through on the freight runs, was simply Mara's rooms, though Mara herself never used the phrase and would have corrected anyone who did. "They are not my rooms," she said once, to a newspaper correspondent who had come to Split Pine to write about railroad winter safety and had been directed to the woman on the embankment. "They are the Earth's rooms. I just found the doors." The correspondent wrote that down. He used it in his article. It was, Mara later noted, the first time anyone had written her name in a newspaper, and the only time she had been quoted accurately. She lived most of her life near the gorge. The cabin on the embankment grew as the family grew. A second room added in 1894, a covered porch in 1897, a proper chimney replacing the original stovepipe in 1900. The viaduct changed owners twice as the railroad consolidated, and each time Mara's position was confirmed by the new management because the alternative, losing the only person who knew where every shelter, guide rope, and supply tin was located along 30 miles of branch line, was more expensive than keeping her. Her hands never fully healed from the first hatch. The scar across her right palm reopened every winter when the cold came, and the skin tightened, and by her 30s it had become a permanent ridge of white tissue that ached when storms approached. She did not complain about it. Pain, she told Levi once, was only another kind of weather report. You noted it. You prepared for what it predicted, and you kept working. She repainted the white ring on the central pier every autumn. She oiled the hatch hinges every October. She tested the inside latch every November, throwing the iron bar and having Levi try the hatch from above, the same test she and Tobin had performed the first time, repeated now as ritual. She replaced the guide rope when the hemp frayed, and the red streamers when the dye faded, and the candle stubs when the wax crumbled. She did this not because anyone required it, but because maintenance was the physical form of the promise she had made to Tobin without ever speaking it aloud, that the knowledge would remain shelter, not just cleverness. In 1903, when another blizzard took the gorge with a force that old-timers compared to 1888, a child from the depot found the guide rope in the dark. The child was 9 years old, a girl from a placement family at the next section east, caught between depots when the storm closed the track. She followed the knots. 3 knots, 9 feet, 5 knots, 15 feet, 7 knots, the ring, and descended the ladder alone, counting the rungs in a whisper that no one heard, and sat in the warm dark until the storm broke, and the section crew found her by the bell wire. Mara was not at the gorge that night. She was at the cabin, sick with a winter cough that Levi had been watching with the careful, quiet attention of a man who remembered what coughs did to people at Split Pine. She did not hear about the girl until the next morning, when Clegg, 73 now, retired but still living in the depot because he had nowhere else to go and no desire to find one, came to the cabin and told her. "The mark was there," Clegg said. "The rope was there. The tin was full. The latch worked. She found it all by herself." Mara listened. She was sitting in the chair near the stove, the same position Tobin had occupied in the boarding house 15 years earlier, though she did not make the comparison and would not have appreciated it. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of coffee that Levi had made, and the steam rose between her fingers and disappeared into the warm air of the cabin. "You repainted the ring in October," Clegg said. "I always repaint the ring in October." "I know," Clegg said. "That is why she found it." Within one winter of the first blizzard, 7 shelters along the Split Pine branch carried red cloth markers, dry tins, and rung counts scratched into boards above every hatch and chamber entrance. Men who had once laughed at Mara Keene now repeated her instructions as gospel to every new hire who stepped off the work train. Block the draft before you make a bed. Stay off wet stone if you want to keep your heat. Leave a breath gap no wider than a finger or the candle will tell you the air has gone wrong. Count the rungs going down because your hands will forget what your mind remembers. 41 people used the lower rooms during storms in the first 5 years. None of them died. 3 of them were children who found the guide ropes alone in the dark, following knots they had been taught to count by a woman most of them had never met. Mara Keene remained at Split Pine long after the railroad changed engines, owners, and paint colors. She walked the branch line every autumn until her knees would not carry her past the second culvert, and then she walked to the viaduct and back, and then she walked to the hatch and stood there with her hand on the white ring and felt the warmth rising through the iron. Her last ascent was in the autumn of 1912, at the age of 41, when she climbed down the 23 rungs and sat on the platform and held the cracked thermometer at arm's length. 53 degrees. The earth had not changed its mind. She hung the thermometer back on the bolt and climbed out slowly, favoring her knees, and closed the hatch and oiled the hinges and went home. The fog came back to Split Pine Gorge every January, filling the granite cut the way it had filled it on the night Mara first saw the headlight through white air. The viaduct arches disappeared upward into the gray. The wind pressed through the gap and found the hatch and could not move it. Below the iron plate, below the stone, below the frost line, the earth held 52 degrees in still air and silence, and the warmth was the same warmth it had always been, slow, patient, indifferent to the opinions of the surface. Abner Clegg had stood on the embankment in 1888 and given his verdict to a girl with 1 mitten and 4 cents. A bridge can carry a train, it cannot carry a life. The white ring on the central pier answered him. The guide rope stiff with frost answered him. A child's mitten drying on a rung answered him. And 30 feet below the gorge floor, where the stone kept yesterday's heat longer than a person kept anger, Mara Keene's handwriting still marked the wall. Rung counts, draft directions, the quiet instructions of a girl who had been told she was unsuitable and who had answered by teaching the earth to hold the living. The bridge had been built to carry iron across the gorge. Mara Keene taught it to carry the living.